Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Definitely a thoroughly brilliant and somewhat crazy piece of work, raises all sorts of issues for us, and is definitely an undeniable foray into romanticism as it is generally conceived. It was actually part of Lyrical Ballads, which was a sort of shared book with William Wordsworth, who's another big key romantic. Some people have suggested that, Coleridge's contribution to that work was a little bit too off to really be a part of it, but alas, that's not our deal to worry about. Coleridge, one thing he was really interested in was just imagination. Like, he was fascinated by the idea of imagination, what the mind could come up with, and beyond anything, we have a really truly excellent and fantastic example here in Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is undeniably a great work of brilliance. It touches on all sorts of diverse and sort of crazy and wild issues. Things like fate, superstition, luck, randomness, punishment, redemption, salvation, curses, spirits, ghosts, all these things. We have all of these things at play in this one work of literature. And the one thing that's really interesting about how he brings it up just in this story that he writes in poetic form is that he doesn't necessarily answer these questions. He just sort of raises them, and then it's our job to sort of deal with them. And that's one thing I think really makes for great literature, is when it raises the questions, but we as viewers or as readers or as thinkers then have to debate and consider them. So as I'm going through and talking about this, I'm of course going to be giving like the idea of the synopsis, but I'm also just going to be throwing out the types of questions that this great work of literature poses, so that we can then sort of consider them on our own and sort of see what we can come up with. So he gets the ball rolling right from the very beginning with this sort of prose passage before part one, where he raises the question, or brings up the issue of whether there are more invisible beings in the world than there are visible. And that's obviously sort of an interesting thing. It shows us that we're going to be going into this sort of ghost story realm a little bit, which I think is a really compelling part of this particular tale. It also raises issues as to whether curses are real and all of that good stuff. So by the time we get to part one, we have this ancient mariner, this old sailor, this haggard looking fellow, and he comes up outside of a wedding and he approaches this guy, this wedding guest, just this random guy. And we have no real idea at this point, like, why he's going to be talking to the wedding guest, like what the wedding guest did to deserve the attention of this particular individual, and why he feels compelled to listen. But nonetheless, he does. And the ancient mariner starts telling him the story of being on a ship with all of these other men. And so they're on this ship and they're sailing along, everything is fine, and there's this albatross that's, following the ship and sort of, following them along on their way. And then one day, seemingly for no reason whatsoever, the ancient mariner, he actually shoots and kills the albatross. And there isn't really any explanation for why he does this. As it says at the end of part one, God save thee, ancient mariner, from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? With my crossbow I shot the albatross. So basically, this thing that everybody on the boat had seen as a sign of good luck, then our friend, the ancient mariner, he kills this bird, which raises all sorts of issues about when is it right to kill an animal. Okay, and these issues come roaring to the forefront in part two, when we get all these ethical questions, right? So the mates, the other people on the boat, they hated the ancient mariner when he shot the albatross. They were like, you did this terrible thing, it's taking our good luck away. But then ultimately, then the luck turns good again. So it raises all these issues of, what is luck? Is that a real thing? And also raises issues of ethics. Okay, so here's sort of a complicated idea. There are a couple different ways of looking at ethics. One of them is deontological ethics. In deontological ethics, you're basically judging a situation depending its ethical righteousness, depending on the situation itself and nothing else. Whereas with consequential, you're looking at the outcome, what happens, what's the byproduct of it. So say, for example, you go and you shoot a lion. Okay, a lot of people would say, deontologically speaking, that was a terrible act. They're an endangered species. It's a great, beautiful animal. You shouldn't go around shooting these things, right? So deontologically, people would say that was an unethical act. But what if just by chance that lion, had you not killed it, would have ended up ravaging an entire village that night and killing a bunch of people? In that context, consequentially speaking, your act of killing the lion became ethical because you had prevented that thing from happening. So you can see it's very slippery terrain as to like how causation is related to this and what's right and what's wrong. But these sorts of issues are brought up directly in regards to the albatross, because the Ancient Mariner, when he shot the albatross, it was like, deontologically, that was a bad act. But then the mates, as soon as it seemed like their luck was still around, they were willing to say, consequentially speaking, you're off the hook. But it didn't necessarily work out in the long run. So some people have argued that Coleridge here is making a commentary on faith, on bad faith, just like believing things for superstitious causes. And there's definitely a lot to be made of that, because he really draws to the forefront this idea of superstition and makes it kind of look pretty ridiculous. So ultimately, by the end of part 2, the luck again has turned bad. The mates are upset. They're being followed by some sort of spirit, and they, to punish the Ancient Mariner, take the albatross and they hang it around his neck. And this is the origin of that phrase, an albatross around my neck. If you've ever heard that, to be described as some sort of like weight dragging somebody down, something that's sort of haunting them, this poem is where that comes from. So also in part 2, we get perhaps the most famous quatrain in this work, and it follows another really beautiful passage. There are a lot of just really beautifully written parts of this. So how about this part in part 2? Day after day, we stuck, nor breath nor motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. So Coleridge definitely has a way with rhythm and a way with language, and that little section there in part 2 is just one of many instances in this work where that comes through. In part 3, we have one particularly fascinating thing that happens. They're approached by this ghost ship, this haunted ship, and it has death and life sort of on this ship, and they're gambling for souls. Okay, so basically what ends up happening is that death wins the 200 mates, the 200 fellows that are on the ship, and death in life wins the Ancient Mariner. So what this means is that all of the 200 men, they're all going to die, but the Ancient Mariner is going to have to live. Okay, and that in a sense, this idea of death and life, the survivor's guilt, right? That having to endure going on while everybody else dies, that's in fact the worst punishment. And ultimately what ends up happening at the end of part 3, it says, one after one by the star-dogged moon, too quick for groan or sigh, each mate turned his face with a ghastly pang and cursed me with his eye. 4 times 50 men, and I heard nor sigh nor groan. With heavy thump, a lifeless lump, they dropped down one by one. So at this point, every single man on the ship, 200 people in the ship, they all die, and every single one of them, before dying, looks at the Ancient Mariner and curses him. Okay, so things are not going well for the Ancient Mariner. Okay, and that brings us to part 4. In part 4, things aren't getting better. Okay, the Ancient Mariner, he's incapable of praying. He can't die, though everyone else has. He's suffering horribly. His mouth is parched. Everything is terrible. His life is awful. He can't even pray. Everything is so terrible. Okay, that also has been denied of him. But then, at the end of part 4, he has an epiphany. He has an awakening. Okay, so all the way up till this part of the poem, he's basically viewed nature, in sort of a negative way, right? Like there's all the slimy, gross things in the ocean. There's this bird and he just kills it. He's just definitely not somebody who's looking for beauty in the world. So then there's this striking thing that happens at part 4. All this horrible stuff has happened. Everyone has died. He's struggling. There's terribleness that's happening. And then At the end of part 4, it says, "Within the shadow of the ship I watched their rich attire, blue, glossy green, and velvet black. They coiled and swam, and every track was a flash of golden fire." He's talking about the snakes and the things underneath the water. And he says, "O happy living things, no tongue their beauty might declare. A spring of love gushed from my heart, and I blessed them unaware." Okay? So at this moment, he has this awakening. He sees beauty in the ugliness. And at that moment, he has this awakening and things change. It says, "Sure, my kind saint took pity on me, and I blessed them unaware. That selfsame moment I could pray, and from my neck so free, the albatross fell off and sank like lead into the sea." Okay, so he sees beauty, the albatross falls off, he's able to pray. Okay, so at this point, it might seem like our ancient mariner, he's off the hook. Okay, he's done his penance. But unfortunately for him, as we'll find out, he's not quite through paying the price for what he's done.